Can I ask about a completely different topic? Again, getting back to Stephen's very interesting contrast in the beginning between the style of reading that you have with the hallowed 400-page novel and the skim and plunge mode that most of us are more familiar with. A lot of literature professors are in panic about this, and yet the book contains a couple of pieces that suggest to me that we ought to be paying attention to new styles of narrative and new cultural forms that are emerging. There's a fascinating piece about Japanese cell phone novels, from which I learned a lot. And my friends who are gamers tell me that the gaming world is getting to the point that Hollywood has been dominating for a long time. In being able now, I think the holy grail of game designers, as I understand it, is to make a game that can make you cry. And I'm told now that this is beginning to happen. Are there examples like these or others that you can think of forms emerging out of the new technology that maybe down the road we'll look at and say, now there's a cultural form that has its own literacy, its own logic, its own values attached to it that people who teach literature or film or other media might want to think about?
I think the gaming thing is a perfect example of that question, when will there be a game that can make you cry, being a misprision completely, of people who are immersed in one kind of literacy, looking at another one and saying, oh, games won't really be great, they won't really be art until they make me cry, like Casablanca did. When in fact, most gamers, who hear this question say, what? Halo is the best, first-person shooter ever made. It's great. We don't need. It didn't make me cry. I don't want it to cry because then I won't be able to see the enemy, and and they'll kill me. So I think that's a perfect example right away of cross literacies and the pitfalls that await. And the cell phone thing is a great. To further plump for the book, it's a wonderful piece about these cell phone novels that young women are writing in Japan on their cell phones, and the kinds of, to go back to your idea of that this is really a new kind of literacy with continuities to print and the changes of the codex and everything. What happens is the girls write these novels, and differently from normal Japanese writing, which goes vertically down the page, these go horizontally, as on a cell phone. And so they're starting to upload these things, and the girls that read them are starting to learn how to read this way instead of that way. And then the thing is coming full circle where these cell phone novels are being printed out and sold as books, but when they reproduce them on the page in the codex form, they're doing them horizontally. And in a great echo of your point about how these literacies are actually masking sort of class identity questions, there are these great quotes from sort of older sociology professors and literature professors in Japan saying, well, my God, but when are these girls going to start to learn to read vertical novels? It's like they've gone horizontal on us as if this were, the end of civilization.
I think the other thing about games that's worth pointing out is, it really showcases the difficulty with the word literacy, because you're so close to literature by using that word. And it's not just crying in games. I think one of the big mistakes people have always made about games is they keep saying, when are they going to really reach that level of kind of storytelling that might involve crying or might involve other kind of emotional responses. And in fact, really for the most part, I think games are not narrative forms. They happen to have this kind of vestigial layer of narrative because they feel like they need to look like movies in some sense. But when you're playing a game, your consciousness as you're playing a game almost always, it's almost never, I really am interested in how this is going to turn out. It's not the feeling of it. The feeling of it is, I have to solve this one puzzle. I have to get, here are all the different factors. I have to think about what I saw in the last 30 minutes and what my ultimate objectives are, and balancing all these different resources and what do I have. And that's not a narrative feeling. You don't sit there in the middle of Middlemarch going like, all right, Dorothea, she's got to get to this next level with Ladislaw, and so if she does this thing, you're like, I want to see how it turns out, right? So it's a very different kind of consciousness. And when you judge it by the standards of George Eliot, it's not as good as Middlemarch. Even the best games are not as good as Middlemarch. But when you judge it by the standards of kind of problem solving and navigating complex spaces and managing resources, which are very complex intellectual skills, it's fantastic, and it's much better than novels. So in the book that I wrote about pop culture, Everything Bad is Good for You, I kind of started with this thought experiment, which was, imagine what would happen if games had emerged first as the kind of dominant form in culture, and then 300 years later books had come along. What would all the kind of, cultural conservatives and critics say about this new form in the book? And they would say, this is terrible. The kids used to sit there engaged in this complex interaction with their peers, solving very complicated problems, thinking on their own, managing resources, coming up with their own endings, and here they are following these linear narratives foisted upon them by these authors, and you see them in these libraries, sitting around silently, addicted to these weird texts. What an awful thing. The kids today,
They used to be camming with other people and
Right.
I actually disagree. It's very helpful the way you put it. I actually disagree. Actually, the game was invented before the novel, before the book. And in fact, people did make exactly this kind of claim about people who basically wasted their time reading books. In fact, they still do today.
Right.
If you grew up in a certain part of the country, people will tell you that. Why should I play football?
Right.
It builds character, my friend. Don't be a nerd, and don't, So anyway, did you go to junior high school? Anyway, in any case,
I was a football star, can't you tell?
It's not true that action is understood purely in terms of getting to the next level or strategic. Action is often understood in terms of a larger narrative in which you're the participant, in which you're trying to make it true. If you're a religious person, you do certain things. You understand against the narrative of your salvation of others, of the larger meaning of it. A narrative imbues all sorts of human action. But I have to agree with you about this, and also with you, Jim. I think that the game, the video game, is really the great form of art that will develop over time. But in order to understand, it won't be whether it makes you cry. That's a very shortened version of a very old idea in aesthetics, which is what makes art great art. And one theory of what makes art great art is like Saint-Saëns. His theory is that what makes music great music is that it's incredibly pleasurable, and it has a beautiful flow, and it has enormous craft, right? And this is why a lot of people think Saint-Saëns is shy. And another vision of art, what makes art great art, is that it plays deeply to your emotions, and it truly reaches in and grasps your emotional life, which another theory is that's what makes you centrally human. And that's the shortened version of it'll make you cry. That's when it becomes great art, and it actually, but then that's really a debate over art, of which you understand the game now as being an example, and now you see it in the line of other forms of art that have these kinds of effects. Great skill, great technique, great humanity, great relationship between emotion. But I have every reason to believe that no matter what your theory of great art is, that games will eventually get there.
I think another component of this that comes back into gaming is the idea that you're participating in building the narrative together, and what goes on with a whole variety of different media that we're seeing do this. This goes back to the old conversations that we used to have around hypertext and what happened here. And I would say I love books. I have a small obsession with books. And I do two really weird things with my books. One, I really like galleys. I like galleys because they're unfinished, right? And I like the idea that the book could possibly be imperfect, right? That it could have mistakes. I get a real sort of kick out of finding mistakes. I also have a sort of obsession with getting my book signed. The reason why I like getting my book signed is because I like being reminded that the author is alive, that there's a person behind that author. And it's these two things that I do because the book is always given to you in this fully finished form where it's all perfect. You have no sense of how it was made, and you have no sense that there's a human behind this. And you're not even supposed to interact with that human, right? And I've read Michael Warner's book, and I'm like, oh, Michael Warner's book, right? And then I'm like, oh, he's a human. Weird. I get to interact with him. And there's something really strange about that. One of the things that you see a whole variety of this online media is about is this reminder that the author is not dead, that the author is playing alongside you, whether they're building the narrative with you in the game, whether they're the blogger who's in conversation with you. Nothing is finished. And there's something really beautiful about the idea, we think about the perpetual beta as being an obsession of Web 2.0. Well, there's something interesting about the perpetual beta of writing and literacy, right? The idea that the encyclopedia might never be finished, right, is kind of intriguing. It really boggles people's brains, right? That, you could possibly, consume an encyclopedia that might be editable. Like, oh gosh, no. But there's actually something really delightful about all of the ways in which we have to think about unfinished writing and unfinished narratives and literacies that are evolving with all of the participants. And what does that mean? And I think we're going to see a whole set of new technologies, from the games to the blogging to all of this, which is all about this unfinished business. And secretly, we all kind of know that none of the books that anybody writes are actually finished. It's more when you were required by the editor to finally turn it over and just not look. But that's not something that's sort of sold to the public, right? It's supposed to be clean and perfect. And we're saying, like, let's tear back those covers and look at the messiness and what unfolds because of it.